Gary Leon Ridgway was introduced to this hellhole on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons born to Thomas Newton Ridgway and Mary Rita Steinman. Thomas Newton Ridgway grew up on a farm near Roswell, New Mexico, sent there as a boy after his own parents in Kentucky could not afford to keep him. He served as an aircraft mechanic in the Army Air Corps during World War II, married once before meeting Mary Rita, and fathered a son from that earlier union. He met Mary Rita Steinman at a USO dance sometime around 1946 or 47, and they married shortly after. Their first son, Greg, was born in October 1947. And then Gary came in February 1949. A third boy, Thomas Edward, called Ed or Eddie, was born in 1951. Tom drove long-haul trucks and took construction work in the summers during those early years. The income was irregular enough that the family rarely maintained a separate household, more often renting rooms from other families than keeping their own place. Greg Ridgway, interviewed by defense investigators during Gary's capital proceedings in 2002, recalled that his mother described the early years of the marriage by saying that all she and Tom had was a can of soup to split. The family never went on welfare because Tom believed in earning what he needed and paying back what he owed, but they grew their own food when they could and scavenged spare parts from junkyards. One of the worst sins a Ridgway could commit, Greg said, was to throw something away before it was completely used up. Tom Ridgway was notoriously frugal, and Gary was the same. Both of them hated to waste money. When Gary's own son, Matthew, was old enough, Gary took him along on the same kind of foraging expeditions through junkyards that Tom had modelled, picking through wrecked cars for anything salvageable, turning over seat cushions, running fingers into cracks in the upholstery, looking for dropped coins. Matthew later told investigators that this was a regular outing, Gary working methodically through the rows of wrecked cars with his son beside him, pocketing whatever change had slipped out of other people's pockets. Relatives on both sides of the family described Tom and Gary consistently as penny pinchers. Neither Tom nor Mary Rita drank or smoked. At one point during the Idaho years, Tom and Mary Rita tried running a restaurant and bar, but Tom grew tired of the environment and the attention other men paid his wife, and they closed it. Tom went back to trucking and construction. Dad was always gone, Greg told the investigators. Always trying to do something to make ends meet. While the family lived in Utah and Tom was away on a trucking run, the youngest boy, Eddie, contracted a high fever that left him with some degree of brain damage. He was considered mildly mentally retarded from that point forward, and the family absorbed this without much discussion. By 1959, the family relocated to Bremerton, Washington, where Mary Rita's father, Ed Steinman, owned a hardware store. They lived above the store for approximately a year. Gary was in the 3rd grade at the time. He remembered his grandfather as strict, someone who let no one interfere with the store's operation and who, in Gary's perception, favored Greg over him. His grandmother, Clara, he recalled warmly. She cooked, kept a cake ready when the family came by, and operated quietly within the constraints her husband set. Tom commuted by ferry each day to Seattle during the Bremerton period, working first for Grey Line tour buses and then for Greyhound. In 1960, the family moved again to Seattle, where Tom eventually took a position driving buses for the regional transit agency, Metro. Mary Rita took a job at the J.C. Penney store in Renton in the men's clothing department. She stayed 30 years and retired as one of the store's most recognized employees. A local newspaper ran a feature story on her retirement. The family bought their first house around 1960, a small rambler with a large lot just east of the airport. Tom and Mary Rita lived there until they died. All three Ridgway sons spent their teenage years there. Mary Rita ran the household with clear expectations. She kept the boys in the Catholic faith, despite Tom's inability to convert, because his prior marriage barred him from the church. Greg recalled that she kept them attending until around 1965, when her own father died and she finally stopped pressing. She was one of the first working mothers in her immediate community, and Greg described her to the investigators as a strong woman who knew her own mind. She made her sons responsible for their conduct. One expression of hers stayed with Greg across decades: "Don't ever date anybody you wouldn't want to marry." Gary struggled in school from the beginning. He was dyslexic, reversed letters, and could not read the way other children read. His teachers assessed him as slow. Family discussions about placing him in a special education class took place around the 4th grade, though he could not say precisely when he was held back a grade, only that it happened. He was placed in a remedial reading class. Getting through school seemed an endless process to him. He attended Tyee High School and graduated in June 1969 at the age of 20, 2 full years older than most of his classmates, with an IQ recorded in the low 80s. He had not given much thought to what he was going to do in life. Greg went on to the University of Washington, studied physics, and spent his career as a computer software engineer. Greg told the investigators that the family never talked much about Gary and Eddie's learning difficulties. He received praise for academic success, while the subject of his brother's struggles went largely unaddressed. Gary's own account was that Greg was the favored son, and that he and Ed were measured against Greg and found lacking. Greg disputed this, maintaining their parents treated all 3 boys equally. Gary also contended with asthma and chronic allergies from childhood. His eyes swelled and watered regularly. Defense team notes record that his eyelids were often droopy and puffy, and that other children frequently assumed he was crying. The allergies continued into adult life. At Kenworth, co-workers sometimes noticed his reddened, watering eyes and took the condition for emotional distress, adding to his reputation among them as an odd figure, the man who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. He explained the allergies more than once to people who did not ask. He was also a bedwetter into junior high school, which his mother eventually addressed by having him help strip his bed and then sitting him in a tub of cold water while she washed him. Rule notes that she scrubbed him aggressively during these episodes, and that being touched there made him aware that it felt good, though the subject of sex was never discussed in the Ridgway household. He told the investigators he remembered those incidents clearly. He recalled persistent difficulty orienting himself when he wandered from home as a young boy, particularly during the Utah years. He could not find his way back. In Pocatello, Idaho, a boy named Dennis waited for Gary in an alley after school and beat him up regularly. Tom Ridgway's response was a warning: come home beaten up one more time and he would beat Gary himself. He then showed Gary how to put his hands up, how to jab and punch. Gary got Dennis on the ground eventually and held his arms, and could see his father watching from a block away, smiling. Both boys were crying. Around the same period, Gary failed a grade and threw rocks through the school windows in response, breaking several. He also set fires in garages and dry fields near wherever the family lived, and told investigators he was drawn to fire without being able to explain why. He carried a knife with him from around the 6th grade. It was black with 4 folding blades, and he liked the feel of it in his pocket. At 16, Gary lured a 6-year-old boy into woodland near his school and stabbed him once through the ribs, into his liver. The boy survived and did not identify his attacker. Gary ran home and hid in the basement. He told investigators he had not planned it and that he was more afraid the boy would live and identify him than he was worried about whether the boy would die. Gary liked shop class and described doing well there. He liked sports too, but he was being placed with older, more advanced students because of his age, not his skill level. And he quit. He worked instead. In junior high, Gary was quiet. He did not feel he could keep up with other kids and said little. By high school, his ease around people improved, particularly with girls. He was a loner outside of school, he said, and had no close friends. Greg noted that Gary was considerably more successful in conversation with women than Greg himself had been at the same age. Gary met Claudia Barrows during his sophomore year. Both worked at a supermarket in Burien, west of the airport, and her father was a career military man. They went to movies at military base theaters, sometimes parked in his car, and dated through the rest of high school and into 1969. Mary Rita tried to discourage the match before they married. When Gary asked her why, she said she thought Claudia might be a little wild. In June 1969, Gary began working at Kenworth Truck Company and enlisted in the Navy, a 2-year enlistment with a 4-year Naval Reserve commitment, which he reasoned was better than being drafted into the Army. Because Greg and Eddie were both about to ship overseas, Greg to Korea with the Army and Eddie to Vietnam, the Navy released Gary early from boot camp so he could see his brothers before they left. During that 10-day leave, Gary spent most of his time with Claudia. He told the investigators she was the first love he ever had, that he loved her from 1965 to 1971. Gary served as a deckhand aboard the USS Vancouver, a ship that transported and landed Marines by landing craft and helicopter, based largely at Subic Bay in the Philippines. Crew members worked 8-hour shifts and were released for shore liberty in the evenings. Most of those evenings ended in the bars near the base. Gary drank. Alcohol was cheap, he said. He tried marijuana once and found it did nothing for him. He formed relationships with Filipina prostitutes in the bars, whom he later said always treated him well and was treated twice for gonorrhea during his service. The ship made one trip to Vietnam, approximately a week before Gary received an honorable discharge after 23 months and 28 days. Gary and Claudia Barrows married during a leave in a military ceremony at Fort Lawton in Seattle in August 1970, performed by a military chaplain over her parents' objections. They found a small apartment near the base in San Diego, and Gary came home most nights. He told investigators he liked married life, the company, the stability, someone his age to talk to, and regular sex. He returned to sea repeatedly, and each homecoming brought changes. Writing was difficult for him, and his letters to Claudia during deployments were not particularly tactful. Both of them were unfaithful. She was bored and lonely in San Diego, and began to date. He did not consider his contact with prostitutes as infidelity. When he returned and she told him she saw other men while he was away, he branded her a whore in conversations for years afterward. She told him the marriage was not working and left for the airport. He told investigators that panic set in and that he considered calling the airline with a bomb threat to stop the plane. He did not. The divorce was finalized in 1972. Back in Seattle, Gary moved into the family house and began cruising the Renton Loop, a circuit past the high school and movie theaters where young people drove with windows down on weekend nights. He met Marcia Lorene Brown there, short and very heavy, not the slim blonde he later described to others. She did not date much in high school because the boys all wanted cheerleader types. When they married in December 1973, Mary Rita would not permit a separate household. They moved into the family home, where Mary Rita controlled Gary's paycheck and made decisions on Marcia's behalf as well, including whether she could get her ears pierced. The couple then decided to move out because Marcia and Mary Rita did not get along at all. During the marriage, they lived in several residences in Renton, Federal Way, and West Seattle. At some point, they moved to a small house in Maple Valley Heights. The house sat in an isolated spot at the end of a road, with high-voltage power lines running directly over the backyard, close enough that they hummed audibly on still days. The lines made many people veer away from the property. The television news around that time carried warnings from scientists that living near power lines could cause cancer. The location suited Gary well enough. They socialized with another couple on weekends, potluck dinners, and cheap wine. And all four attended a new Southern Baptist congregation whose minister held services at a compound in Maple Valley called the Aqua Barn, which operated a swimming pool and a stable that rented horses. The pastor preached that wives and daughters who did not obey their husbands would be barred from heaven, that women could not wear red or cut their hair or hold positions of authority in the congregation. Gary followed these directives entirely and stood to read scripture aloud on Sundays. He was skinny in an oversized suit, hair combed down over his forehead, entirely serious. When the pastor criticized the other couple for insufficient attendance and they left the church, Gary stayed. His son, Matthew, was born on September 5, 1975. According to the prosecutor's summary of evidence, Marcia later reported to investigators that Gary enjoyed sex outdoors and was interested in bondage. She said he was often gone in the evenings for long periods, sometimes returning dirty or wet, with no explanation. During the latter years of the marriage, he began coming home later and later without logical explanation. When they walked in the woods together, he liked to hide from her and then creep up behind her to frighten her. He liked to practice walking noiselessly. On at least one occasion, which Gary later acknowledged, he choked her using a police-type hold, his forearm and upper arm around her neck. Their relationship deteriorated. Marcia underwent gastric bypass surgery in the late 1970s, and the weight came off rapidly. She began going out to the Eagles Lodge, staying until closing, telling Gary she spent those nights at a friend's house. He called the friend's house and was told she was not there. They separated in July 1980, and the divorce became final on May 27, 1981. She took primary custody of Matthew. Gary had the boy on alternate weekends. That November, he purchased a house at 2185 932nd Place South, a few blocks from Pacific Highway South. After the divorce, Gary joined Parents Without Partners, a social organization for single parents, and attended meetings regularly. From roughly 1981 to 1985, he maintained a relationship with another member of the group, a woman named Roxanne Theno. He also became engaged to another woman from the group, with a wedding planned for June 1984. She broke it off after meeting someone else. He still worked at Kenworth, punctual attendance, 30 years without being fired, something he told investigators he was proud of. But his conduct at the plant drew notice. In the employee break room, some co-workers found him unusually religious, reading aloud from the Bible, which he sometimes left open on his workstation. He went through phases where he preached about loose women, until spittle flew from his mouth, then cycled without apparent transition into making obscene sexual remarks in the cafeteria. There was also a habit of approaching women from behind and touching them without invitation. One co-worker told investigators he came up behind her and began massaging her shoulders shortly after she started working there, and she made a point not to be alone with him after that. A formal reprimand for sexual harassment followed at some point during this period. Gary asked a co-worker he trusted whether she could believe it. He also submitted suggestions to the plant's safety program in his role as safety monitor, and co-workers responded by mailing him a roll of toilet paper and naming him Safety Man of the Year as a joke. Gary told investigators he learned to take it. At lunch, he sat in the same spot every day in the Kenworth lunchroom, drank tea, and ate a packed lunch. His nicknames at the plant included Wrong Way Ridgway, earned after he painted a design on a truck backward, costing the company $14,000 to fix. He hated the nickname but could not show it, he said, because he feared being fired. There were additional episodes of confusion at the plant during this period, a 3-day stretch in which he added wrong chemicals to the paint and occasions when he painted the wrong truck entirely. The bosses always let him do it over. A former manager described him to a newspaper as a steady Eddie, a very normal employee, very trouble-free, and said that nothing in Gary's behavior would have suggested what investigators now believed him to be. In February 1985, Gary attended a Parents Without Partners gathering at the White Shutters Inn on Pacific Highway South. A woman named Judith Lynch, nearly 5 years his senior, was there with a friend. She tried at first to ignore him, thinking he was too young, but he was polite and attentive, and they danced and talked. Judith's father was killed in Korea when she was 6. She suffered from epilepsy until her mid-20s, which kept her from driving until her 30s, and driving still made her anxious. She was previously married for 18 years and had 2 adult daughters. Gary courted her over the following weeks, meeting at a McDonald's between their shifts. He was on swing at Kenworth. She taught childcare skills at a local high school. He bought her dinner and came back each week. She told investigators he was always nice and comfortable, that she felt happy and trusting with him. He was welcoming to her daughters and made no objection when one of them moved in with her young family for a time. Gary and Judith married in 1988. They rarely went out. They camped, raised dogs, and kept their yard and houseplants. Gary stopped by his parents' house after every shift. After Tom Ridgway died, he kept stopping, checking on Mary Rita daily. Judith managed their finances, paid the bills, and gave Gary spending money for his workdays. She rarely gave him more than he needed for breakfast, lunch, and gas. They moved several times and bought a better house each time, staying always in South King County, Des Moines from 1989 to 1997, then Auburn. By 2001, they lived on South 348th Street on the West Hill of Auburn, in a house nicer than anything the family owned before. Judith decorated it as she wanted. Dolls, artificial flowers, crocheted afghans, frilly lace on the chair arms, Christmas stockings with their names embroidered on them hung above the fireplace. They kept a motor home, a newer pickup, and a sedan. Away from work, Gary was a familiar presence in his neighborhood. He kept his lawn in top shape and worked in the garden alongside whoever he was living with at the time. Neighbors described him to investigators and reporters as someone who was always pleasant in over-the-fence conversation, with gardening, swap meets, and garage sales as his main topics. He was quiet to the point of near invisibility in his daily domestic routine, mowing, washing his truck, painting his fence, but always willing to talk if someone came out. Mark Prothero, his defense attorney, who met Gary for the first time shortly after his arrest, described his first impression in his book, Defending Gary. Gary's physical appearance was not what he expected. He was too ordinary, too small, too calm, too polite. He lived beside neighbors for years who barely knew his voice. Mary Rita Ridgway died of colon cancer in the summer of 2001. Gary and his brothers spent the months before her death organizing her financial affairs, and Gary stopped by after work every day until she died. She worried, he told investigators, that the brothers would drift apart after she was gone, and wanted everything taken care of and the family kept together. And maybe it was for the best, because some months later, on November 30th, 2001, Gary's secret life was finally revealed to the public as he was leaving the Kenworth truck factory, where he worked in Renton, Washington. This was the so-called human side of Leon Ridgway, one of the most notorious serial killers in US history. I hope I earned your subscription today. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, and if you didn't, hit the dislike button twice.